New York City's Great White Way, Broadway. Throughout the 1920s, the nightlife here glittered. Bands played, and liquor flowed, and everyone who was drinking it was breaking the law. In the first month of the new decade, the 18th Amendment became the law of the land. The sale and consumption of alcohol was now illegal.
There was prohibition, but oddly enough, nobody paid any attention to it.
You went to people's homes, they served dreadful things called orange blossoms, which was gin and orange juice. Revolting. And bad gin at that.
Liquor was now sold behind closed doors in places called speakeasies. Proprietors took the risks and reaped the profits.
It was good money in them days. I was 15 years old. I was riding around with a Nash convertible. We had 4 speakeasies. One by the Daily News, one by the Daily Mirror. You had a peephole, you let him in. Okay. A guy had to explain who he was, and he'd show you ID or something, and you let him in. You got to know it was like family after a while.
Every corner had a saloon on it. Of course, they were never raided by... Their cops were a big part of that business, too. People wanted to drink. It was a great game.
It became a dangerous game for the high-stakes players. Battles between rival gangs for control of illegal liquor territories riddled American cities with mushrooming murder rates. Prohibition's aim was to sweep liquor off the city streets. Now they were flooded with gangsters and guns.
I used to carry 2 persuaders myself. You had to have them, or else.
Prohibition and the general disregard which followed it was the perfect symbol for the 20s, a decade which was about crossing the line, smashing tradition, breaking boundaries. As modern America came of age in the 1920s, boundaries of all sorts, technological, geographical, and social, were shattered.
Hey, what's going on, APUSH people? We have a good one for you today. This one is on the entire decade of the 1920s. I'm continuing my decade series here. And the 1920s is a very important time in U.S. history, so let's get started. All right, pre-1920s. We'll start with the Progressive Era, which was from the 1890s to 1920. And this is when we saw a lot of government regulation and involvement in the United States economy. World War I ended just prior to 1920, and the U.S. entered the war in 1917 due to the Zimmermann Note in German unrestricted submarine warfare. Now, here is the Zimmermann Note. We notice that a German ambassador sent a telegram to Mexico urging them to attack the United States, and that really helped draw the United States into war. During World War I, we also see restriction on freedom of speech, in which during times of crisis, your rights as an American do go down, and this was upheld by the court case Schenck versus the United States in 1919. I have a video in the description, lots of videos in the description for you to check out. At the conclusion of the 19-teens, we have the first Red Scare. It's called the first one because there is a second one, and this was caused by a couple different things. The Russian Revolution in Russia, in which that country turns communist, emergence of radical ideas in the country, and immigration as well. And unions and immigrants were associated with radical ideas and communism. So let's take a look at these 2 political cartoons. We have a European anarchist. An anarchist is somebody who's against government. We see this European immigrant with a knife and a bomb in his hand sneaking up behind the Statue of Liberty. So he, according to the cartoon, is going to come and do damage to the United States. Now, labor unions, what begins as strikes, can lead to disorder, can lead to Bolshevism, can lead to chaos. That is the point of view of this political cartoon. So these 2 political cartoons portray unions and immigrants in a negative light. We also have Sacco and Vanzetti, two immigrants, which we'll talk about. They're not necessarily during the Red Scare, but a continuation of this fear of immigrants and radical ideas. Let's jump on over to the election of 1820. We have Warren G. Harding versus James Cox, the Democrat, and Harding is a Republican. Harding campaigned on a return to normalcy. What does this mean? Well, it's reverting to isolationism or neutrality and less government involvement. He's promoting the ideas of laissez-faire. And essentially, this is a turning away or an undoing of the progressive era. And as we can tell by this electoral college map, Harding wins in a landslide. He pretty much wins every state except those in the South, and he beats Cox 404 to 127. And Republicans would hold the presidency throughout the rest of the 20s until the election of 1932. All right, U.S. foreign policy in the 1920s, important to understand. Well, really in the beginning, we had the defeat of the Treaty of Versailles, and that's because of Article X and the creation of the League of Nations, which the U.S. did not join. Now, we see here this political cartoon, this bridge is missing a piece in the middle, and the keystone, or the most important part, is the USA. So the League of Nations was designed by the President of the U.S., Woodrow Wilson, but the U.S. did not join. So what was the U.S. relations with other countries like? Well, they followed a unilateral foreign policy, which really means one-sided or pursuing their own interests, not really getting into alliances or agreements with other countries. They had selective military interventions, and this really was mostly in Latin America. Nicaragua, for example, the U.S. sent troops in between 1912 and 1938 to restore order and kind of invoke that Roosevelt corollary. International investment, we see a continuation of dollar diplomacy or banks and businesses investing in foreign countries. And the U.S. maintained isolationism as well. And that will really be the foreign policy theme carrying over to World War II. All right, let's talk about some social issues of the 1920s. We had the first Great Migration, and this is occurring during and after World War I. Again, it's called the first because we'll have a second one. And this is when African Americans are leaving the South to the North and Midwest, and they're leaving due to segregation or Jim Crow laws, racial violence such as lynchings, and limited economic opportunities because really farming and sharecropping was the major source of income for many African Americans in the South. So they moved to the North and West. So we can see this political cartoon. They're moving to cities like Chicago in the North, New York, and then St. Louis out in the West. Now, they did find economic opportunities in these places, but they still faced discrimination. They also encountered lower paying jobs such as janitors, dishwashers, a lot of manual labor jobs. And an effect of the Great Migration is the Red Summer of 1919, which were race riots in many northern cities, especially in Chicago. So these were race riots between African Americans and whites in cities as a result of the Great Migration. Now, the well-known W.E.B. Du Bois during that time wrote about coming back from World War I in these race riots, and he wrote, "This country of ours, despite all its better should have done and dreamed, is yet a shameful land. We return from fighting, we return fighting." Now let's jump on over to immigration. We have the Emergency Quota Act of 1921. This restricted the number of immigrants from a country to 3% of the total people from that country living in the U.S. in 1910. So, for example, there's 100 people living in the United States from Italy in 1910, then they would only be allowed to have 3 immigrants come to the country in 1921. Now, the National Origins Act of 1924, signed by Calvin Coolidge here, this restricted immigration even further, and it cut the quota from 3% to 2%, and it used the 1890 census instead of the 1910. And the purpose of these acts was to put an end to unrestricted immigration. Sacco and Vanzetti were 2 Italian immigrants that were charged with robbery and murder, and they were anarchists, atheists, and draft dodgers. So this really was a big fear in America during the 1920s, the ideas that they represented. Now, their trial really focused on their beliefs more than the evidence of whether or not they actually committed the crime. That is still up for debate, but historians pretty much agree they did not get a fair trial, and they were both executed in 1927 in Massachusetts. Okay, let's focus over to cultural issues. We have gender roles are a very big topic during this time. Flappers, they would challenge gender norms. And these were women that drank, danced, smoked, cut their hair short, and wore shorter dresses. When I say shorter dresses, that's for that time. These dresses are below the knee, and they were considered short for that time. Margaret Sanger emerged as a women's rights advocate and advocated birth control, which was very controversial during the 1920s. And we also have the proposed Equal Rights Amendment that was introduced in the 1920s but does not get approved by Congress until 1972. But even then, it does not get added to the Constitution. You'll see in future videos. Modernism, we have the 1920 census. More Americans are living in cities for the first time in U.S. history, and many workers will lose autonomy in factories due to things like scientific management and the assembly line. Science versus religion is a hot topic, and this is evident through the John Scopes trial. Here is a biology teacher. I don't know about you, this guy just screams he's a science teacher to me. And he taught evolution in a Tennessee school, which was illegal to do in that state. And this trial really focused on the literal interpretation of the Bible versus evolution. Okay,
Along with and sometimes propelled by the great technological leap in the 1920s, social patterns in place for decades also began to shift. Nowhere was this more obvious than with the changes for American women. An expanding job market had given more and more women careers and the disposable income to do with what they wished. Throughout the 1920s, women would assert a newfound freedom and independence, and nothing symbolized it more than the 19th Amendment. In 1920, after 81 years of agitation, women won the right to vote.
A woman's lot had changed in almost every way. She thought that she had the right to live for herself rather than for her family, for others, as women were always supposed to. She went to bars. She went to after-hours clubs. She went to wild parties. She had much shorter hair. She wore much more makeup. You go from having young women whose dresses reach to their ankles to flesh everywhere. And a lot of 20s culture is about the fun of smashing prohibitions.
The more daring women of the day were known as flappers and vamps.
Sure, I remember flappers. They were all over the place. I mean, they were older than me. But, you know, when you look at the flappers through the eyes of a young guy, wow, whoa.
I think a flapper was the type of young woman who just wanted to see how far she could go and then would stop because she'd be afraid to go too far. And a vamp didn't care how far she went.
The shattering ways of 1920s city life were spread by the media to rural America, places where the changes were not always so easy to get used to.
Smoking or drinking, being loose with talk, using profanity, this sifted down from the cities, from New York and Chicago. And this finally had a unwanted place in our little community. Here was a girl who'd come home from, she'd been working in Chicago. She'd come home with short dresses on. Well, they were not wearing short dresses. They were going to church with hats on and with white gloves on. They were decidedly concerned about what future generation is going to bring.
This country was founded on a respect for God and a sense of righteousness and keeping of the Sabbath day, and people brought their children up under discipline and under the reading of the Scripture. And all of those things were part of the things that bound us together in America.
The people were solid, with church going and very little crime and so on.
As the cities grew in size and influence, many people in small-town America found them threatening, a breeding ground for new and often alien ideas. In one small American town, the forces of traditional religion and modern science would clash in a battle heard round the world. Here in Dayton, Tennessee, in the summer of 1925, one of the century's most famous courtroom battles would take place. John T. Scopes stood accused of teaching Darwin's theory of evolution, that man and ape shared a common ancestor. That was against the law in Tennessee. The Scopes trial attracted the best legal brains of the time. William Jennings Bryan, 3 times presidential candidate and a Christian fundamentalist himself, came to prosecute. Clarence Darrow, the celebrated Chicago trial lawyer, came to defend Scopes. Outside, as the trial progressed in the scorching summer heat, Dayton had itself a carnival.
People would bring in trained chimpanzees dressed in suits and ties, and they'd lead them up and down the streets.
Read Your Bible was everywhere in town, posted up on the street, across the street, banners. And you walk maybe 100 yards this way and you'd have a street preacher. I didn't know what he was preaching about. And you never saw the same people twice. You go to the same place next day, there'd be some other people from some other part of the United States there. But it was a lot of hoopla. I enjoyed it.
The Scopes trial became emblematic. Everybody had to make up their mind. People who'd never been to Tennessee, couldn't even find Tennessee, had to think about this question. Do I believe in modern science?
At times, it seemed that the whole world had converged on Dayton.
The aisles were filled and the walls were lined with newspaper people from England, from Spain, from France. We had so many newspaper people there that you couldn't stir them with a stick.
When all the hoopla ended, John T. Scopes was found guilty and fined $100, a ruling later overturned on a technicality. What Scopes represented and what the world came to witness was a colossal clash of ideals. The cool reason of science seemed to threaten the deep and abiding roots of religion. It was one thing to replace the family mule with a Model T, but quite another to trade Matthew, Mark, and John for Einstein, Freud, and Darwin. For many people, these were confusing times. And what may have been the most unsettling about the pace of change in the 1920s was that people really wanted both the benefits of the future and the familiar comforts of the past.
Then the Manasseh Mauler lashed out in his old ferocious style. Several fast, deadly punches.
In a decade fraught with so many changes, people in the 1920s seemed hungry for old-fashioned heroes, and an explosion in spectator sports provided them. Sports giants became household names, their every move followed by radio and an eager tabloid press. One name was known in more households than any other.
In our family, we were never baseball-oriented, but I would have had to be deaf not to have heard about Babe Ruth.
George Herman Ruth, the Babe, reshaped America's pastime. In an era of big events, he excelled at the game's biggest excitement, the home run. He hit 60 of them in a single season in 1927, a record that would stand for 4 decades. Fans drove from miles around to see him.
We used to get in the truck, 7 of us, put hay in the truck and just sit on it. And in 3.5 hours, we were from Scranton to the Yankee Stadium. It was 35 cents to see the Babe, Lou Gehrig, all the Yankee players.
Babe Ruth was a hero. Lou Gehrig was always my hero. Seems like everybody back then was a hero. We'd write and get autographs. They graciously sent us pictures. 3-cent postage stamp, you got your picture back. Very, very nice time to live. Felt good to be an American.
Technology of the 1920s, we have emergence of very popular media such as the radio, which is a huge source of entertainment. The playing of the novel War of the Worlds occurred in 1938, and we also had the emergence of soap operas and fireside chats under FDR when he becomes president. The cinema or movies develop, motion pictures become more popular. You have Nickelodeons, which cost a nickel to get into. Movies during the Great Depression would be a huge source of cheap entertainment. And The Jazz Singer in 1927 was the very first movie with sound. And also, of course, you can't talk about the 1920s and technology without the automobiles. The mass production was popularized and pioneered by Henry Ford. He did not invent the car, but he pioneered the mass production of it. And this allowed for vacations or personal mobility and later the growth of suburbs.
Throughout the 1920s, new technologies would transform daily life. At the beginning of the decade, most Americans lived without electricity. When night fell, only candles and lamps held off the darkness. America was electrified in the 20s. Electric lights extended the day, opened up new possibilities for work and play. That surge of new power came first to the cities. And by the decade's end, the majority of American homes had electricity.
You can't understand this century without understanding the effect, the impact of science and technology.
My father's generation is the one that really saw amazing changes. He was born in 1900 in a world where the horse was still the main means of getting about. The car seemed to me more revolutionary in a way than anything that's happened since. Totally changed the kind of space we live in, really.
The car would give Americans a sense of autonomy and freedom. The freedom to escape their city or town, to go away on a vacation, or simply on a day's outing. By mid-decade, the government was spending more than $1 billion on the construction of highways, bridges, and tunnels. The beginnings of a national infrastructure which knit the country together. From its scratchy beginnings in 1920 as a mere hobby, radio would become a nationwide phenomenon as important as the car. Young radio enthusiast Albert Sindlinger was there at the birth of modern radio. In 1920, the night station KDKA, broadcasting from a factory rooftop in Pittsburgh, transmitted the results of the presidential election.
One of the gentlemen was reading the election returns. He got sick, so for about 35 or 45 minutes, I read election returns. Nobody had any comprehension of the significance of what was going on. But don't forget, there were only a couple of hundred listeners. Within 6 months, every store in America, even grocery stores, were selling radio sets.
Suddenly all Americans were listening to the same things, laughing at the same jokes. It was a kind of communal exercise here, and very much a strengthening of your notion of what it was
in Harlem, New York.
American.
This was a celebration of African American culture through writing, music, art, you name it. And many African Americans flocked to Harlem during the 1920s from the South. Again, that's part of the Great Migration. Some key figures you should be familiar with. You have Langston Hughes, this incredibly well-known writer. Here's one of his poems. This is, "The night is beautiful, so the faces of my people. The stars are beautiful, so the eyes of my people. Beautiful also is the sun, Beautiful also are the souls of my people. And the Harlem Renaissance really celebrated African American culture and African Americans as evident by this poem. Zora Neale Hurston was an author, a very well-known author during the time, and Duke Ellington was a jazz musician. And these are just three of the many, many people that took part in the Harlem Renaissance. Okay.
Gershwin, who wrote Rhapsody in Blue and other anthems of the decades, was profoundly influenced by the new music he had heard and loved called jazz. The capital of jazz in the 1920s was just a subway ride uptown in Harlem. It was in Harlem clubs that one could see the artists at the forefront of this fresh and uniquely American music. Performers such as Louis Armstrong, Bessie Smith, and a dapper young man named Edward Kennedy Ellington. His friends simply called him Duke.
Duke was the essence of what black music was all about. Everybody else was heading in that direction, but Duke was there.
The first time that I was seized by the music was the first time I heard Duke Ellington broadcast from the Cotton Club, where Broadway, Hollywood, and Paris rub elbows. People came from all over the United States to experience what was going on in Harlem in the 20s.
I was young then, and often we went up to Harlem at night to dance and everything. We all saved up for months to get the money to go out to a nightclub. And of course, the music was wonderful.
Harlem was contributing more than music to America's new urban culture. The world above New York's 125th Street was, in the 1920s, a hotbed of political, social, and cultural activity. It was later called the Harlem Renaissance.
The Harlem Renaissance was one of those fancy terms that white folks invent when they want to take a particular look at some aspect of black folks. I don't think black folks run around saying, well, we're going to have us a renaissance or something like that, but it was a holiday of the spirit.
In Harlem was born this idea of the new Negro, someone who stood up for the Negro, who advertised his and her contributions to American culture, who was proud to be black.
Harlem was the end of the line, the promised land, the place where all our fantasies came true. If I had to choose between heaven and Harlem, Harlem, of course, would win every time.
On the 1920s economy, the government took a laissez-faire approach, as I mentioned earlier, and Calvin Coolidge gave a famous quote that said, "The business of government is business," and that really kind of summed up his view of the purpose of the government was to help out businesses. Secretary of Treasury Andrew Mellon, who was the Treasury Secretary for Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover, so from 1921 to 1932, he advocated tax cuts for the wealthy. And this is very similar to Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush's tax plans of the 1980s and early 2000s, respectively. Farmers during the 1920s continued to produce at very high rates that outweighed demand, and this would lower crop prices. When in doubt, throughout American history, when farmers are in debt, they end up producing more in the hopes of making money, but that drops the price further. That will be the case until we get to the New Deal. The stock market experienced a bull market for much of the decade, which means that continued to rise. But on October 29th, 1929, we have Black Tuesday, the stock market crash, which many people point to as the start of the Great Depression. It's not the cause, but it's the start. And banks closed throughout the early 1930s as a result, and many people ended up losing their money. Jumping on.
The roar in the Roaring '20s was the birth scream of the modern. America was now about to leave behind the formative experience of its rural past and embrace the promise of an urban future. But progress would have its price. A sudden, wrenching departure from the certainties of the traditional and the familiar, spread by an emerging mass media, movies and the radio. Things that seem old and familiar now were just beginning to take shape in the 1920s. At the dawn of the 1920s, America was clearly entering a new era, an era defined by a vast and complicated urban culture that would dominate the rest of the 20th century. After World War I, there was an eagerness to embrace the new, and it was in America's cities, most dramatically in its biggest, New York, where the modern age was born. The very architecture of the city spoke of America's new ascendancy and her aspirations.
The skyscraper was an example of the new form achieving a kind of thrilling scale and nobility. More people worked there than lived in the average small town in America.
A movement to the cities that had started during World War I accelerated. In 1920, for the first time, more Americans lived in urban centers than in country towns and villages.
The pace is being set in the cities. The city is irresistibly attractive, is really at a kind of high tide in this decade. It's a force, a magnet.
The very names of New York streets would become synonymous with progress and innovation. Broadway would represent the best and latest in American entertainment. Madison Avenue would come to stand for the bustling new business of advertising, which was uniting the nation in a set of shared fantasies and desires. And Wall Street came to represent the decade's expanding economic opportunities. Wall Street was where the action was. People came from everywhere to get in on it.
The reason I come to New York was there was nobody there after they closed the mines in 1926 in Pennsylvania. There was no money coming there. This fella Jerry got me the first job. And he said, "Come on down to Wall Street. The streets are paved with gold."
It seemed that way, too, on Park and Fifth Avenues, where the tycoons lived. The number of millionaires in the 1920s jumped 400% over the previous decade. The 20s' feeling of limitless horizons was fueled by their lavish lifestyle.
My father took my mother and me in the car for the first ride through the Holland Tunnel. This was opening night. All the cars were lined up to go through the tunnel. I was petrified. I cringed. Suppose the water leaks in. How did they build the tunnel under the water? Where's the water? And I imagined as we were riding through the tunnel that I heard the waves overhead. Out on the so-called highways of those days, outside of New York, we saw the billboards.
Roadways were soon dotted with a new phenomenon, roadside advertising.
They were big and colorful and beautiful, I thought.
Advertising helped transform not just the physical landscape, but the cultural one. Along with advertising came the expansion of a brand new consumer concept, credit. The old inhibition against debt came tumbling down, as everything from cars to clothes could be bought on time. Buy now, pay later became the order of the day. By 1927, 75% of all household goods were bought on credit. And in the last years of the decade, the item desired most was the radio.
The most extraordinary thing about the decade of the 20s was a pandemic air of optimism, a feeling that the future of the country was unlimited. One of the great jazz songs of the day was Blue Skies, only but blue skies do I see.
The president promised blue skies in the country's future. At his inauguration in 1929, Herbert Hoover repeated the common wisdom of the day that Americans were on their way to riches. If proof was needed, all one had to do was look at the bubbling pool of wealth, the stock market.
The butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, everybody, oddly enough, was in the stock market. One of our chauffeurs was in the market. If he can be in the market, anybody can be in the market.
There were no regulations as we have now. People got away with murder all the time. The government didn't bother them. So they were all making money. They were doing very well.
A boom in buying had driven up stock prices. Suddenly, in October of 1929, investors started cashing in their overpriced stock. A panic of selling started.
On October 29 of 1929, it was obvious from the opening bell that things were wildly amiss.
At 9:30, there was a rumble on the floor. One of the page boys said, "Hey, Mike, look at the sell orders coming out of those phones."
The wheels really started to come off. The stock market went into a free fall. Crowds gathered in the street outside of the exchange.
At 3 o'clock, the bell rang and that was it.
More than $30 billion in paper value simply vanished that day as the stock market crashed.
The famous word, the crash. Overnight, it was like bombs fell.
The 20s bubble had burst, and with it, the decade's optimism.
People lost every penny that they had. Nobody had any pensions. There was no Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. If people lost their money, that was it. They were down and out.
People jumped off the George Washington Bridge, which had only just then, not long ago, been built. People we knew. My father was wiped out. He never, psychologically, he never recovered.
In 29, I lost $1 million. What do you do? It's the same story. Wash your face and hands and comb your hair and start all over again.
But as people would find out in the decade to come, a decade is different from the 20s, as night is from day. Starting over was not going to be so easy. America, along with much of the world, faced the Great Depression. That's on the next episode of The Century, America's Time. I'm Peter Jennings. Thank you for joining us.
Other 1920s info, we had The Lost Generation. This is a group of writers that criticized 1920s culture and materialism. You see that in people like F. Scott Fitzgerald and The Great Gatsby, T.S. Eliot, James Joyce, a bunch of other authors. And this will be similar to the Beat generation of the 1950s, many authors that also criticized middle-class culture. We'll come back to that in the 1950s. Marcus Garvey is an influential leader, and he advocated black nationalism, or really black separatism, from white culture, and he founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association, the UNIA, and he promoted a Back to Africa movement that people from all over the world of African descent should move back to Africa. And he will inspire Malcolm X in the 1960s. So his ideas will carry through to the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s. The KKK reemerges during this time, and it's a reaction to New Immigrants and the movie A Birth of a Nation, which glorified the KKK. And in addition to targeting African Americans, the KKK went after immigrants, Jews, and Catholics. All right, let's talk about some test tips for the 1920s. For multiple choice and short answer, be able to identify and describe the causes and effects of the first Red Scare, the Great Migration, nativism and immigration quotas, and of course, know the Harlem Renaissance. When it comes to essays, you could see a topic on comparing and contrasting, for example, the 1920s and the 1950s, or comparing and contrasting the Red Scares, the post-World Wars, culture of these decades, something like that. So this, to me, lends itself to a compare and contrast type of an essay. All right, guys, thank you very much for watching. I do appreciate it. Check out my Decades playlist and other videos in the description. I wish you nothing but the best of luck on all your exams, especially the one in May, and have a good day.